Welcome to this week's Who the Folk podcast. I'm Lonnie Goldsmith, the editor of TC Jewfolk. This week I talk with defense attorney Eric Rice, who last year defended Jaleel Stallings against the Minneapolis Police Department and won a sizable settlement from them. We talk about Jaleel's story, how Eric is pivoting his legal practice in the aftermath of that case, and we discuss the question of can the MPD be reformed on this week's Who the Folk podcast. Eric Rice, welcome to the Who the Folk podcast. Thank you for joining me.
No, thanks for having me on.
So you were recommended to me by your wife, Sarah, that you would be a great guest on the podcast. Earlier this year, you had won a Lawyer of the Year award for 2021 for your work in defending Jaleel Stallings against the Minneapolis Police Department. I guess for people who don't know, who is Jaleel and how did his case come to great prominence in the community, and how did you find Jaleel to get involved?
Sure. So I'll just start with myself. I've been an attorney for more than a decade in the Twin Cities. I do criminal defense and also civil litigation. And as part of that work, I was contacted by Jaleel's family when he was first arrested. That came a couple days after the death of George Floyd. Jaleel was protesting at the time, and he had a gun on him. And the allegations came out that he fired at a van full of police officers. So his family was concerned, contacted me to find out more about the situation. And through my representation of Jaleel on those criminal charges, I learned that there was a lot more to the story than just what the first allegations were. I'm happy to get into all of that now, or we can kind of go piece by piece. Let me know how you want to proceed.
No, for sure. So ultimately, you successfully defended him and went on to settle a lawsuit with the MPD. But I guess what are some of those factors that came out through your investigative work that ultimately led to successful outcomes down the road?
So, yeah, I think it's, it takes a little bit of the drama off to kind of start at the end and know how everything's going to play out, because I didn't have that luxury,
That's fair. That's fair.
For the year and a half. So I just want to point that out that, I can't diminish that completely. But yeah, I was able to successfully get Jaleel acquitted after a criminal jury trial, and then we got a $1.5 million judgment against the city and the involved officers. And at first blush, that might sound a little weird when Jaleel was on camera shooting at a van full of officers, but that's because through the process, like I said, we learned a number of concerning issues. It's hard to, this is the type of case where it's hard to even figure out where to start, because all the pieces kind of relate to each other. And I think it's important to look at them holistically to get the full context of the situation. This is not a case where there was kind of one or two bad officers and their misconduct was found out, and thankfully we corrected it. But this also isn't a case where, everyone was acting poorly, but it's kind of what I tell people is through Jaleel's case, I kind of found every pitfall in the legal system and we had to work our way through it. And it was that kind of feeling of as soon as you kind of get past one challenge, another one would rise up. So to start at the beginning, Jaleel was out a couple days after the death of George Floyd trying to protest. The streets were pretty shut down that evening. There were concrete barriers, traffic was being diverted, things were a little chaotic. So Jaleel and his group couldn't get to the larger protests that they wanted to. They ended up at kind of a random parking lot in Minneapolis, stopped there for a bit, and were trying to figure out what was going to go on next. Jaleel is an Army vet. He had a permit to conceal and carry a weapon. He had a weapon that was purchased by him and registered in his name on him for protection that evening, because earlier in the day, the governor and I think the mayor as well, but there were reports about white supremacists and other, actors trying to cause chaos to the civilians. So Jaleel was armed and wanted to have it for his protection. At the parking lot, they walked down the block to go trying to find protests, and some people down the block say, don't go any further, there's some people shooting out of a truck or something. And I apologize, let's say up front, I'm kind of going off memory here. I don't have the records in front of me and stuff. So, but yeah, this is just my recollection is they go down the block, they find some people who are saying, don't go any further, people are shooting out of a truck. So Jaleel and his group go back to the parking lot and say, okay, what are we going to do? What's our next step? Do we want to find a protest? Do we want to just go home for the night? While they're trying to figure that out, someone comes running by on the street. It was Lake Street, comes running past a building shouting, they're shooting, screaming it. So one of Jaleel's members of his group goes to the street, looks down the street where the person was running from, and immediately turns around scared and starts running. So at this point, Jaleel thinks something's happening. I don't know what, but I'm in danger. So he turns to go behind his truck, looks around and sees the other members of his group going to get into their vehicle. So he stops, turns back toward the street which is toward the front of his vehicle to get in the driver's side door. As soon as he does that, he sees a white unmarked van come past a building with the sliding door open, driving slowly, and immediately 2 shots are fired toward him. He hears 2 bangs. He feels a hard impact to his chest. He thinks he's been shot. He thinks he's bleeding out. At that point, he raises his gun, which he had in his hand. He fires 3 shots toward the van, but doesn't strike it. He tried to just suppress the attack. So what he did is he fired kind of low into the front of the van, so that way he wouldn't hurt anybody, but stop the attack, allow him to get into cover, which he does. He gets behind his pickup truck, looks out over the back of it, and immediately sees that the van is not taking off like you'd expect civilians to do so. It's stopping. And people are getting out of the van shouting shots fired, and people are ordering him to get on the ground. That's when it clicks that, oh, these are not civilians. These are police officers in the van. He immediately drops his gun. He lays out flat, arms over his head. I mean, this was in the aftermath of George Floyd. Jaleel thought he was going to die. He thought that police were going to shoot and kill him because, he had just shot toward the van. So he does everything in his power to make himself as non-threatening as possible. One officer runs up and kicks Jaleel repeatedly in the head and strikes him. Another officer runs up and is beating Jaleel. And while doing that, Jaleel is remaining essentially motionless. It's impressive how little defensive action he's taken while being struck by the officers. Eventually, the officers calm down. They arrest Jaleel. He's taken to the hospital. Turns out he has a fractured eye socket from the beating he endured. And he's interrogated. And again, in each of these points, I could go into detail about all what happened, but the short version is Jaleel is charged with attempted murder. He's charged with assault on the officers. He's taken to jail and held incarcerated. The officers report that Jaleel made a threatening motion toward them, and that's why they fired these less lethal rounds toward him and his group in the parking lot, and that Jaleel was resisting arrest while being arrested. And then in the criminal complaint, it suggests that Jaleel was trying to confirm whether he killed any officers or not in his interrogation. It turned out through my investigation, and again, there's a whole bunch of talk about the body cam videos and how I was able to find additional information. But it turns out that these officers had been explicitly directed to go down the street and shoot at people that they saw, and that's what they did that time. They had been doing that earlier in the evening. There's not a lot of indication that they were responding to a safety threat. It looked more like they were causing a safety threat by escalating the violence of the situation. There's also video showing that Jaleel did not resist at all during arrest. And in one of the court proceedings, a judge found that officer statements claiming resistance were false. But yeah, so the short of it is we were able to go to trial and successfully show self-defense, that Jaleel was not the first aggressor, that these officers were basically given a directive and engaged in a pattern where they were going down shooting at people with less lethal rounds, that Jaleel thought he was reasonably in fear for his life, that he did not know and could not have known who was in the van or why he was being shot. There was additional evidence that officers tried to conceal their appearance, that they were running into an issue earlier in the evening where civilians would flee at the sight of law enforcement. And these officers appeared to be frustrated that people were fleeing before they could be shot with less lethal rounds. And so what the officers did is they led with this unmarked van, despite having a whole caravan of marked squads behind them. They led with an unmarked van, and one officer in the van shortly before they encountered Jaleel said, "Have the marked squad stay behind us so we can shoot at people with 40 millimeter rounds." So they appear to have intentionally concealed their approach so they could first shoot at people, and then after getting some hits on, scare the people off and make them flee. It turned out that, like I said, with the resistance thing, that they falsely exaggerated Jaleel's culpability. They did not accept responsibility or just for their own actions, for the safety threat that they posed, for the escalation that they did, for the unjustified force. And there was just a string of false reporting by the involved officers, and then there were a bunch of investigating officers. So there was a whole caravan of cars behind the van. And so within moments after the encounter with Jaleel, there's probably dozens of officers in the parking lot swarming them. And those officers, didn't see exactly what happened, but are there moments after, and they asked the team, first, did anybody shoot? And the officers say no. And, how did Jaleel get hurt? Well, he was resisting, is what the officer says, even though the video shows that Jaleel was in no way resisting. And despite having these officers involved at the scene, and despite having a separate team of officers doing the criminal investigation, it was handed off to a homicide investigation team because they were not involved. None of these issues were flagged. None of these issues were reported on. And if you just go read the paper reports, it seems to be a pretty clear case that Jaleel made a threatening motion. Officers responded with less lethal fire, and then Jaleel resisted after, being apprehended, and it seems like an officer ambush. But the video didn't show that. There was an instance where Jaleel was pretty certain that he got shot in the chest, but the police seized his clothing from that evening, and they didn't report about it. There was no reports written about his clothing, but I suspected that, these officers were shooting these marking rounds, these less lethal 40 millimeter rounds. And so we asked that his shirt be inspected. And when they pulled it out from police custody, there's a big bright green paint spot on the middle showing that he got struck in the chest by a round before he shot at the van. I question why that wasn't documented or reported by the police team. Seems pretty relevant to me, especially when self-defense is a potential issue. Even after we got Jaleel acquitted, there was no recognition of the faults and nothing happened until we tried to correct the story. Yeah, I'm kind of jumping place to place because, like I said, and feel free to stop me and narrow things.
Well, no, it's because it's the kind of story. It's not. I mean, there's obviously sort of a beginning, a middle, and end of your involvement and how everything happened, but I understand how the retelling of it is not necessarily a linear situation.
Correct. And things kind of play on each other because, like I said, you have multiple issues at stake. It's not just, again, a couple officers in a van shooting at people, and scaring Jaleel, and, oh, that's a shame. I didn't even mention earlier in the evening, this team is basically using civilians as target practice to see how their long range, less lethal rounds work, and are laughing about it and joking about it. And this was not an isolated incident. For example, the driver of the van had a conversation with the use of force trainer at the time. And the use of force trainer in another area was talking about how, how he didn't appreciate that the press was around to cover the protests, and also about how the group that the police were with must be white because there's not burning and looting or something like that, or fires and looting. And to hear that sort of conversation come from the use of force director for the Minneapolis Police suggests that this is pervasive. This is culture. This was kind of, I don't know if it was deliberately planned or a strategy, but I mean, this is a pervasive response. Right. This was not just one team in a van. Because when that team in the van gets to another location, they miss the protesters to shoot at. They've already been dispersed. And the officer there says, you know what we're going to do? We're going to drive down Lake Street, and you see people, we're going to F them up. We're going to gas them, basically use force on them. And the sergeant of the van seems almost gleeful to carry that order out. He goes back to tell his team, you know what? We're going down Lake Street. We're going to shoot people. And there's cheering, and people are laughing, and they're excited. Again, this is not... I mean, that's the thing that strikes me is this is not one officer. This is not a team of officers. This is a culture that sought to respond to a community grieving, a community frustrated by police, callousness and violence. And they responded with further callousness and violence toward that community. And it strikes me to my core.
So it sort of begs the question, given how you ended that there, speaking from the defense attorney side, how does something like that get reformed? Because obviously what Jaleel went through was terrible, and the ordeal he was put through by the police in that situation, it is awful. But how does that get reformed?
Well, since Jaleel's case, I have been using the better part of my energy to try to call attention to the issues which seem pretty clear to me and offer procedural reformation, not even, big groundbreaking things, but like, for example, have a little bit more redundancy in your reporting, processes, or maybe don't have the officers investigating be the ones who are also working with the officers who are involved, that sort of thing. Mm-hmm. And I've not found much traction, and it's dispiriting to me. And that's the takeaway I get from Jaleel's case, is that people are very happy that Jaleel was acquitted, that the truth came out in his case, but nothing has been done to correct the systemic issues that led him to be in that position. And I haven't even gotten to the crux of the case. I mean, the whole reason we were able to win is because one officer happened to leave his body camera recording on for 2 hours instead of making kind of an isolated clip of the incident itself.
Oh.
And to have Jaleel's fate, to have the decades of his life hinge on whether one video file is created versus multiple, again, shocks me. And as an attorney, not even as a defense attorney, just as an attorney, as a person in the system, I find that unacceptable to have such a thin margin between justice and what Jaleel was facing. And it concerns me greatly. And so I guess to get to your question, how do you reform this? I mean, it's pretty simple. You empower the good people, you discourage the bad people. And so in this case, what does that mean? Well, that means the officers who wanted to do the hard but right thing, own up to what happened. Yes, we directed officers to go down the street and shoot at people. Yes, we did that. Empower the officers who stand by that truth, who want to report that. Discourage the bad officers, the ones who falsely justified their use of force, the ones who falsified reports, the ones who didn't do thorough investigation and sought to cover the backs of their fellow officers. I haven't gotten to the prosecution yet, but, it raises a lot of questions, too, as to why Jaleel was prosecuted. A lot of people think that, oh, well, maybe, the prosecutor didn't know what was happening, or, there was some surprise or something like that. Like, no, I was going back to my records and I had a pretty good sense of what happened about 2 weeks after this case was charged out. Jaleel went to trial a year later. And I can tell you from my side, I pleaded with the prosecutor to give Jaleel's side some weight, to give some credit to his self-defense, and to not make Jaleel stand trial where he faced a minimum of 10 years incarceration for these charges. And he did. He had to go in front of a jury, and a judge permitted that. And I brought a motion to the judge asking the judge to, as a matter of law, acquit Jaleel, dismiss the charges, and the judge denied that. And so what that means that if a jury had found that Jaleel had committed criminal activity, that was the proper result under the legal system. And given the facts, given the evidence in this case, I mean, again, it's a hard result for me to swallow. And the fact that it stood on a knife's edge and we had to rely on people outside the system. I mean, that's the other thing that gets me is you have all these people inside the system. You have the police, the prosecutors, the judges, and all of them had the power but didn't use their power to divert this out or to set things straight.
Right.
And the people who did at the very end was the jury, people who are outside the legal systems, the one who came in at the end and said, this is unacceptable. This is a case of self-defense. Jaleel should not be going to prison. And why did the help have to come from the people outside the system? Why can't the people inside the system have, done something? I think it was well warranted under the law and under the facts. And since this case has gone more public, I haven't heard a lot of response from the other side saying that Jaleel should have been prosecuted or should be in prison. And so why did it have to get to this point?
Right. It's interesting, ironic timing. You and I are having this conversation, just to throw a date on this, which we don't always do, but I think it's helpful for greater context in everything we're talking about. Today is Thursday, November 3rd. Early afternoon. Earlier this morning, the Minneapolis City Council unanimously confirmed the new Minneapolis police chief. As somebody who I think people are hopeful is this sort of bridge to reform or something, at least something, better than what has been happening, than what you had to face and defend clients against. That happened today. So it's just sort of interesting that we're having this conversation on a day where Minneapolis made a pretty important announcement that may hopefully lead to some sort of restructuring or reformation in some way.
I mean, we'll see. I'm frankly skeptical because, again, it's today, but we're, 2 years out from George Floyd? I mean, the Stallings case has been public for a year, and I personally can't point to any significant changes that have been enacted. And frankly, I believe that if you impose new rules, from what I've seen, bad actors are just going to find ways around those rules. I mean, that's the issue in this case is, frankly, officers should not be driving around in an unmarked van shooting at people for no reason, right?
It feels pretty obvious. That's a pretty low, that's a low bar.
We don't need a rule for that, right? Or, I mean, we have a rule for that, and we just need people to follow it. well, why did this happen? And why did it get so far? And why wasn't it revealed?
Mhm.
And again, that's because we have a system in place, a culture in place that protects these people and these activities. And until that culture is changed, it's not going to really matter what you write on the paper because the actors are going to do what they want. They're going to act in their own interests and they're going to act according to their incentives. And right now, what do you hear? What's the drumbeat out, side is we need to be tough on crime. We need to support our police and blah, blah, blah. And that empowers people in the system to kind of put a little thumb on the scale or make marginal movements toward putting people away. That's where Jaleel was. That, my opinion is that if Jaleel had been attacked by civilians, if there had been a group of kids or something riding around an unmarked van shooting paintballs at people, you'd probably be saying they're lucky they're not dead. And why would we charge Jaleel, right? Seems pretty clear case. If a police officer is standing in a parking lot and an unmarked van comes up and starts shooting at the police officer and they get hit in the chest and the police officer fires back, what do you say? Well, what'd you expect? Of course, he's going to act in self-defense. So what's the marked difference when you put police officers in the van that, again, at trial seemed pretty undisputed that Jaleel couldn't have known they were officers. They weren't acting like officers. They didn't announce like they were officers. And like I said, there was a discussion about how they didn't want people to know that they were officers. And you put Jaleel in the parking lot. And what's the difference? Why does he get charged, not only charged, but have to stand trial? And that's just because based on the status of them being officers, based on the status of Jaleel being who he is, nobody was willing to take him out of the system. Nobody was willing to say, I will stand up. I have his back. He's not getting charged or charges are getting dismissed. I'm putting my name on it.
And this is, obviously, as you've rightly pointed out, this is something that goes beyond simply police misconduct. I mean, it starts there, but obviously it's not all on the police. It is on the legal system at large that failed here in the end, right?
Well, it's interconnected. And that's why I say, like, I don't want to kind of pull pieces apart. I don't want to say we got, officers in a van shooting at people and they, that's the problem.
Mm-hmm.
Well, why are they comfortable shooting in the van? Why do they think they can do that? Why do they think they can explicitly order people to go down the street and shoot at people and then do so? It's because they're protected, because they trust that their other officers, if things go sideways, will have their back and will kind of justify their actions or make sure that they're not held to, their feet aren't put to the fire.
Right.
And the police can do that. They can kind of exaggerate and massage facts or not thoroughly investigate a case because they trust that the prosecutor won't hold them to scrutiny, because a prosecutor's not going to go to the police and say, you didn't investigate this properly, or why didn't you follow this lead, or why didn't you report this, right? Didn't happen in Jaleel's case.
Right.
And then a judge, given this testimony from officers and given this case from the prosecutor, is not going to say, you know what, now I can't trust the police at all, or now that, whenever the prosecutor brings me a case, I'm skeptical and going to face it with scrutiny. No, the judge is generally going to defer to the police and prosecutor because that's how the system needs to work. And so it's kind of this interrelated system of, again, just allowances and permission of people pushing on the margins and other people covering for it and not holding people to account. And where do all those costs fall down to? To people like Jaleel.
Mm-hmm.
Jaleel's the one who bears the costs for all of that. He's the one who is attacked because of a system that permits it. He's the one who stands on a knife's edge and has to basically prove his innocence through sheer luck of getting access to police records that were inadvertently created. And he's the one who has to go to a jury, to people outside the system, in order to find his justice. I'll say, so I mean, it all just falls on people like Jaleel. That's the bottom line. Those are the people left picking up the tab.
It's so crazy to me that, and I you've mentioned it a few times, and I can't shake just how insane it is that that's what your case sort of depended on, was an officer not dealing with the body cam.
Well, because, yeah, I'll be more explicit, because this is a mundane detail that you would not think like, oh my gosh, this is going to make the case or make sure that Jaleel doesn't spend decades in prison. But in my opinion, I mean, this is the linchpin.
Yeah.
Because if you look at the videos from just the incident, so what happens is officers wear their body cams and they hit the button to activate it, right? And what it does is there's a 30-second buffer, so the video goes back 30 seconds, but the audio starts when they hit the button. So you basically got just that incident. And what you see in Jaleel's case is officers in a van, who knows why, but rolling up, you see Jaleel moving in the parking lot. Again, don't know why. Jaleel makes some movements. Officers fire some shots. On the videos from the officers, it's pretty obscure. There's a car that just happened to be in the way, so you can't exactly see what's happening with Jaleel or the officers at the time, but kind of shots on both sides. and then, the aftermath. And so from just that snippet, you'd say, well, I don't really know who started what or why things happened, or, should Jaleel have known they were officers or anything like that. One officer, though, started his camera at the beginning of the night and let it roll all the way through until the end of Jaleel. And so what I got to see there is there was a pattern. These officers, this team, before they met Jaleel, went to a bunch of other places and shot at people who were not posing a safety threat, shot at people who, in my opinion, didn't deserve it. They were laughing and joking about shooting people, and they were literally directed to go down Lake Street and shoot at people with 40 millimeter rounds. Now, none of that was in the reports by the officers. Not one officer thought to report, hey, we were explicitly directed to go down Lake Street and shoot at people. Jaleel was one of the people we were directed to shoot at. Here's what happened. Right. And so if you combine the incident videos with the reports, there's not enough to establish self-defense. We needed that prior conduct, that pattern, that directive, and we only got it because that one video was part of the files. I went to the prosecutor and asked, I said, can I, based on this video, get all the additional body cams of the police? And the prosecutor said no. I had to bring a motion to compel. I had to go to a judge and demand that that evidence be released so I can prove my case of self-defense. Right. If you're here thinking, well, the prosecutor wanted to find justice just as much or was just as concerned with the objective truth, I didn't experience that.
Oh, no, I'm not coming away from this conversation at all thinking that. So I will dispel that for you. Shouldn't go any longer in this conversation without asking, how is Jaleel physically, mentally, emotionally in the aftermath of this?
Well, I mean, on one sense, he's doing well that he's not in prison, and we both are we both recognize the fact that he could very easily be on a prison phone call right now, and we could be working on his appeals, pardon, those sorts of things. And we're appreciative that he's not. Mm-hmm. But I mean, the thing with Jaleel is the day before this incident occurred, his life was on one trajectory. He had a self-identity that was something completely different. And now this is what defines him. He had a year and a half plus of trauma. This is basically the defining feature of his life. And he needs to figure out how to move forward with this, as his experience. It also, I know it troubles him greatly that he went through all of this basically for nothing, that there are no police reforms, there are no prosecution reforms, there's no judicial reforms, there's no legislative reforms, that by and large people seem to have moved on. And a lot of these troubling issues that could just as well happen to somebody else in his position are ripe to happen. And that troubles him greatly because it would give him solace to say, you know what, he went through this, but it was for a greater cause. It was for a purpose to prevent other people from being unfairly targeted and, thrown in an unjust system. And he can't say that.
So when you started practicing 10 years ago, did you think that you would be sort of, in addition to being a lawyer, be doing the sort of accountability work that you've obviously taken on, wittingly or otherwise?
I didn't expect it to be this type. I have always been drawn to defense work because I've always perceived that as kind of, that's the side of the scale that could use the most guard, I guess. The government has great power. It has investigative powers. It has, it enjoys kind of credibility and deference in the legal system. And I've always been drawn to the defense side to kind of balance that out. People ask me, how can you be a defense lawyer? How can you represent criminals? And to me, it's more about fairness and justice. It's making sure that the rules we set, we follow. So when we say someone's presumed to be innocent until proven guilty, I want to make sure we follow those rules because I believe in the justice system. When we say that officers should act independently and impartially and conduct an objective investigation, I want to hold them to that. I want to make sure evidence supports guilt and not just bias or prejudice against, certain people or defendants. That's what I want to do, and that's where I focus. So that's what I expected my work to pertain to, is making sure that I hold the line and keep the government and the judicial system to what it said. I will say that after my experience with Jaleel's case and after the aftermath of finding just how resistant the system is to meaningful change, I am actually looking to transition careers. I am no longer planning to continue practicing criminal defense. I plan to move toward a more a civil police misconduct practice but I cannot in good faith continue my work as a criminal defense lawyer. I am shaken by the system. I am extremely concerned at the shortcomings, the resistance to fixing them. And as a defense lawyer, it is often my role to tell my clients to have faith in the system, to find it legitimate, right? A lot of clients come through my door saying, I was, improperly attacked. The evidence they have isn't good. This process is corrupt. And it's my role to tell them, no, this is the American justice system. This is how it works. This is the fair way it works. This is the process we have. And we're going to play by the rules, and you're going to accept whatever result happens at the end. And it's my job to do that to my client. Mm-hmm. And I feel that after my experience with Jaleel's case, I cannot serve that role any longer. I cannot tell my clients to remain silent, to buy into the system, to treat it as fair, because my experience has shown me that, you know what? We have good rules in place, but we don't always follow them. The justice system doesn't always mean what it says, and that troubles me.
As it should. And to go back to something that you had said, earlier, people asking you, about representing criminals. And I think that framing right there is so much of one of the many things that is wrong with the system, because you're not necessarily defending a criminal. That's not how the system works, right? I mean, they're entitled to a defense, but like they should get to go through the legal process just like anybody else to determine guilt or innocence.
Well, again, if you're going to follow the rules you set, presumed innocent until proven guilty, yeah, you're exactly right. They're not criminals. There's someone accused of a crime, and there is a process for the government to go through, hoops that they must meet. There's evidentiary standards they have to meet to establish criminality, and then and only then does the accused turn into a criminal.
Right.
But, again, it's kind of like with that dialogue that we're having right now politically with, the Hennepin County attorney's race pending and other political issues. That doesn't seem to be how the general public approaches our criminal justice system. And frankly, I think a lot of people inside the criminal justice system don't strictly adhere to that either. I can just tell you as a practical matter. It would be a lot of work and it'd be very difficult and disruptive to have such a high bar and, a massive amount of process for everybody in the system. Like you go to any arraignment calendar and there can be 40, 45 cases on call for that morning. You need some sort of efficiency way to process them through. But sometimes that comes at the cost of, again, the aspirations, the rules we set. And sometimes people like Jaleel get caught up in that and, are treated as kind of collateral damage.
So does the work that you started in the law doing, and now certainly the issues you're transitioning to, how does that sort of fit with your Judaism and sort of within your upbringing and how you like to practice?
Well, sure. And I could just speak personally to my Judaism, we don't want to speak, as Judaism as
no,
large.
Absolutely. Because I think how everybody practices is going to, and how everybody looks at it is going to be different. So,
which I feel is a very Jewish viewpoint of, I can speak for myself. But, Judaism is kind of a legalistic tradition. It's about, we're going to set rules. You follow the rules, you engage with the rules. And justice and in fairness, I feel, is one of the core tenets of Judaism. That's kind of ingrained from a young age. It's also a very questioning religion, which as an attorney, especially a defense attorney, I appreciate. It doesn't just take things for granted. It doesn't just assume things. You need to prove it. You need to show it. You need to earn it. And I feel that translates into my work of, being questioning, and again, not in a bad way, not in a, adversarial way, but just, again, kind of checking your work and making sure it's earned and substantively warranted rather than just kind of accepting it at face value. But yeah, I'd say that my work is just, consistent with the history of Judaism, how Jews have engaged, throughout history, and kind of the tradition of, engaging with rules, of questioning things, of, seeking just solutions and trying to care, as part of the community. So I've tried to, be a servant of those principles in my professional work as well.
Well, excellent. That's a excellent outlook on how to sort of merge both the law and your Judaism. I think that's a very natural way those two things come together. Last couple questions, and we will let you get back to your day. First, what is your favorite Jewish holiday?
It's got to be Purim. It's the most fun holiday, right? So
true, very true. And favorite Jewish food?
Pastrami on rye. I mean, that is hard to beat. That is excellent a food development. So I'd have to go with that.
That is a. Don't get that answer nearly as often as I probably should. Possibly because of the lack of really what I think is like that level worthy pastrami here, but
yeah, and I say in my ideal mind, I'm not thinking of any Minneapolis sandwiches.
No.
Like we're talking New York or something.
Of course, no, I'm with you.
It's can't beat a good sandwich. So
absolutely, Eric Rice, thank you so much for taking the time to talk with us this week, and best of luck as you transition your practice into a sort of interesting new development, but one that is certainly needed, and we wish you the best of luck with it.
I appreciate it. Thanks for your time today.
The Who the Folk podcast is part of the Jew Folk Podcast Network, a product of Jew Folk Inc. Please subscribe, rate, and review the show wherever you get your podcasts. If you have suggestions for other podcast guests, please email them to me at editor@tcjewfolk.com. For our other shows, check out tcjewfolk.com/podcast.